This is going to be a mix of talk and readings, and nearly all of it scripted by Dickens, fortunately. This is Dickens's season. Everywhere you go, there seems to be another production of Christmas Carol going on, so he's still going very strong and earning lots of credits, not so much money. Although I did read the other day that Dickens, or rather the Dickens brand, apparently brings in something like £280 million a year, which he deserves a round of applause, really, to the UK economy, tourism and adaptations and everything else. But it's particularly good to have been able to recruit his services this evening for a cause that he would very much have cherished. Well, to turn to our theme for the evening. Suppose I said to you, this is a pretty respectable audience. Would you take that as a compliment to your quantity or your quality? I mean it for both, of course, but I suspect more people would take it as an indication or a compliment to the size of the turnout than to how properly people were dressed and behaved and so on. And that's largely because respectable, I think, and respectability have lost a lot of the edge that they used to have. Particularly respectability. It seems very little used now, respectability. It has almost a kind of sepia tinge to it. But it's very, very different from its value and usage and edge in Dickens's time. And I just want to give a couple of examples of this from Dickens's own experience. We take the case of Dickens's public readings. He began to read for charity in the 1850s, and these were very, very successful readings, fairly informal, and then decided towards the end of the 50s to go professional. It was shock horror from his friends, his close friends, because they thought it was not at all a respectable thing to do. He was jeopardizing his status as a distinguished man of letters by going on the platform in front of lots of people and getting money for it. And worse still, they knew, of course, that Dickens wasn't just standing and reading in this sort of respectable way that I'm doing now, but he would suddenly dance into character. So the whole of what Dickens was proposing was edging far too close to theatre, the common theatre, and that was not at all respectable. Well, Dickens compromised by not giving readings in theatres, by and large, using mainly town halls or concert halls, this kind of venue, really. And furthermore, he was dressed in a very formal way. He was in white tie and tails, gold watch chain, gold cufflinks, immaculately turned out for these readings. It must have been a very strange sight, because particularly when he chose to do a reading from Oliver Twist, notorious one, of Bill Sykes' murder of Nancy. And Dickens put everything into it. So there was this distinguished-looking gentleman in white tie and tails, when it came to clubbing Nancy to death, smashing his hand down on the desk like that, so violently that he dented his gold cufflinks. And I've seen those. They're held in private collection. It's quite an extraordinary sight. It really is. I mean, the world of imagination making that kind of impact on the material world is something that's peculiarly attractive. These readings were attended by journalists, and they would write it up the next morning, say that Mr. Dickens has come to Birmingham or whatever. And the first thing that they would comment on very often was the audience, in the way that I started this evening. And they would be very struck by the character of the audience and remark on how respectable it was. And they so often use this word. And that meant, and they were talking mainly about the people around them in what would be the stalls, except that it wasn't a theatre. There would be a number of distinguished, other distinguished writers, military officers, senior barristers, well-known politicians, and so on. And this would give a certain class or status to the audience. In other words, what Dickens was drawing were people who would probably never have been seen in a common theatre, except perhaps in disguise, because the common theatre was too associated with the demi-monde, the disreputable side of theatricals. So they were very impressed by that. So respectability then had a very distinct cachet, and it was one that was applied as a kind of indicator of social value. It was very much tied to social status, and social status was very often tied to wealth. One of the most prominent social critics of the time, Herbert Spencer, remarked that all Victorians seem to grow up with the sense that wealth and respectability are two sides of the same thing. And this is a period when poverty was increasingly seen as a cause for shame, a kind of moral failure. So there were huge pressures to better oneself. Ruskin, another great social critic, art critic of the time, said everybody thinks it is his duty to try to be a gentleman. Everybody thinks it is his duty to try to be a gentleman, and a gentleman with money. So this kind of self-gentrification was something that preoccupied Dickens throughout his career. Great Expectations being, I suppose, the classic example of this. So Dickens's readings then, the issues of status and respectability preyed on Dickens throughout his life, starting at his birth. He was born in a small terrace house in Portsmouth on Friday, the 7th of February, 1812. His father, John Dickens, who was the model for the improvident Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, decided that this needed a flourish, and that he needed to make an announcement in the local Hampshire papers, and he paid 3 or 4 shillings, I mean, something probably the family could ill afford at the time, but he was determined to broadcast this great event. Now, the standard entry for births in these papers, to try to keep the thing as compressed as possible and therefore as cheap as possible, would go something like this. Births on Friday at Mile End Terrace, that was the Dickens house, on Friday at Mile End Terrace, the wife of Mr. Dickens, or the wife simply of John Dickens. Simple as that. Well, what John Dickens wrote was as follows: births on Friday at Mile End Terrace, the lady of John Dickens, Esquire, a son. Esquire at that time, and remember this is Regency England. Jane Austen was living about 30 miles away, up at Chawton. Pride and Prejudice was going to come out at the beginning of the next year. Esquire was really only used for landed gentry at the time, and perhaps senior members of the professions. Mr. Darcy was a kind of epitome of somebody who would rightly earn the title Esquire. Well, John Dickens, at the time of Charles's birth, was an office clerk and the son of domestic servants. So it was really quite a statement for him publicly to appropriate that title Esquire. And in fact, of course, it was an ominous sign of what was to come for the family, because he wanted to be an esquire. He had these high social aspirations, and he lived and entertained way beyond his means, landing the whole family in the debtors' prison in London. He was arrested for debt, but at that time you could bring the family in to the prison. So he was there in the Marshalsea prison in the borough with his wife and the 3 youngest children. So all 5 of them were locked up in the Marshalsea. Charles, who was 12 years old, was left to lodgings in a boarding house near the prison, under the supervision of a landlady. And he was sent out to work as a packer in a tumble-down, rat-infested warehouse overlooking the Thames. A 60-hour week in this job, earning about £30 in today's money, but it's kind of purchasing power equivalent. 20 years later, Charles Dickens was an international celebrity and earning something around £6,000 a week. He died in 1870 and left an estate worth, in today's money, about £14 million. So he had made it into the squirearchy. But compared with John Dickens's framing of the birth announcement, here are some clauses from Dickens's last will and testament. I emphatically direct that I be buried in an inexpensive, unostentatious, and strictly private manner, and that those who attend my funeral wear no scarf, cloak, black bow, long hatband, or any other such revolting absurdity. I direct that my name be inscribed in plain English letters on my tomb, without the addition of Mr. or Esquire. So Dickens's last act is yet another defiance of conventional Victorian respectability. But it's no wonder then that he's fascinated by the social and moral implications of very suddenly coming into a fortune and then having rapidly to adapt to very different social worlds. But here anyway are some of the outward indicators of respectability that drew Dickens's comic treatment, and it's really the comic treatment that we're looking at this evening. Respectability was associated with a formality of dress and bearing, of course. The idea being, in the cant phrase then, the formation of a demeanour. To ensure the right composure in mixed company, you have to avoid certain topics in polite conversation: politics, religion, sex. You must also know the rules of etiquette, all the way down to how to handle your knife and fork. There was actually at the time, in the early 19th century, a particular genre of fiction called the silver fork fiction, or the silver fork novel, which were stories of life in aristocratic circles with an immense amount of detail on the dress and conduct of high society. And effectively, these were kind of manuals of etiquette, opportunities for sort of middle-class voyeurism, to get to know what's happening in upper circles. And then, if you were going to be lucky enough to be catapulted up to that, you would have some sort of savoir-faire. You'd have some familiarity because you'd read it in silver fork novels. But here, on a much humbler level, I mentioned Great Expectations a little while ago. It's just a little moment in that novel where young Pip, who's the blacksmith's boy who's come into his fortune, is up in London in lodgings with his friend Herbert Pocket, who belongs to the slightly higher classes, and Pip asks Herbert to teach him a bit of etiquette so that he feels more comfortable with this, particularly the handling of the knife and fork. And this Pip does very benignly and with a light touch over their supper table, whenever he sees Pip committing some terrible faux pas. He says, "Oh, in London, it is not the custom to put the knife in the mouth, for fear of accidents, you know. The fork is reserved for that use, but it is not put further in than necessary." Scarcely worth mentioning, and it's as well to do as other people do. Also, the spoon is not generally used overhand, but under. This has two advantages. You get at your mouth better, which after all is the object, and you save a good deal of the attitude of opening oysters on the part of the right elbow. Respectability also entails some cultural sophistication, at least a kind of conversational familiarity with the arts and foreign travel, and perhaps some classical history and literature, most of which you would accumulate during the grand tour. But here is a comic example of the struggle to acquire this particular badge of respectability. And it's a couple of scenes from Our Mutual Friend, Dickens's last completed novel. There are two main characters. One is Silas Wegg, a rascally street stallholder who specializes in selling halfpenny ballads and is always out for the main chance. And Mr. Boffin. Mr. Boffin is a benign old ex-servant who has suddenly inherited a fortune from his former master, and this is catapulting himself and his wife into higher social circles, where they feel they must acquire respectability. However, old Boffin is illiterate, and he realizes that he must get to know some fine literature and ancient history. So he goes out and buys several volumes of Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and then starts looking for somebody to read them for him and his wife. Unwisely, he identifies Wegg, the ballad seller, as a literary man who might be suitable for the task. So one day he accosts Wegg at his stall and explains what he wants. And we join them at the point where Wegg is wondering aloud why Boffin doesn't try to learn to read himself. Oh, it's too late, says Boffin. It's too late for me to be sifting and shoveling at alphabets and grammar books. I'm getting to be an old bird, and I want to take it easy. But I want some reading. I want some fine, bold reading, some splendid book in a Lawmere Show volumes that will reach right down your point of view and take time to go by you. Now, how can I find that reading, Wegg? By paying a man so much an hour to do it, a man qualified to do it, say twopence an hour, to come and read to me and Mrs. Boffin of an evening. Now, what do you think, Wegg? Well, I'm very flattered, I'm sure, sir. Was that the offer you're thinking of making? Yes. Do you like it? Oh, I'm considering of it, Mr. Boffin. Yeah, considering of it. Oh, look, I don't mean to tie a literary man down too tight. I mean, an extra halfpenny or an hour sharp partus of the time's your own to choose after you finished your work here on the stall. Now, let's say twopence halfpenny an hour. Twopence halfpenny an hour. 2 hours of an evening is five pence. 6 evenings a week. 30 pence. Half a crown. Half a crown, Wegg. Half a crown, yeah. Ain't much, sir, you know. Half a crown. Per week, you know. Yes, per week, yeah.
as to the strain upon the intellect, now, was you thinking at all of poetry, sir? Oh, well, would it come dearer? Yes, it would come dearer, yeah. For when a man has to grind off poetry night after night, it is but fair he should be paid for the weakening effect upon his intellect. Oh, well, I hadn't thought of poetry really, but, well, if you was to tip us some of your ballads sometimes, then, why, then we should drop into poetry. Yeah, so, what do you think, Wig? Mr. Boffin, I never bargain. No, sir, I never did haggle, and I never will haggle. Consequently, I meet you fair and square with done for double the money. Oh, well, you know better about these things than I do, Wig. Yeah, all right, agreed. Can you start this evening? Yes, I believe I'm not otherwise engaged, sir. Yeah, yes, I think I could. And you have the necessary implement, a book? Huh? Bought him this morning, 8 volumes, red and gold, with a purple ribbon in every one to show where you left off reading. You know him? The book's name, sir? Oh, I thought you'd have known him. His name is Decline and Fall Off the Russian Empire. You know him, Wig? Yeah, well, I haven't been right slapped through it very recently, Mr. Boffin being otherwise engaged, but Decline and Fall Off the Russian, I should say so, sir, ever since I were a lad.
So, Scene 2. So the arrangement was confirmed, and Mr. Wegg arrived that same evening at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Boffin to embark on the inaugural reading. There he was introduced to Mrs. Boffin, a stout lady of a rubicund and cheerful aspect, dressed, to Mr. Wegg's consternation, in a low evening dress of sable satin and a large black velvet hat and feathers.
Mrs. Boffin, Wig, is a high flyer at fashion, and her make is such that she does it credit. As to myself, I ain't as fashionable or respectable yet as I may come to be. Henrietta, old lady, this here's the gentleman, is going to decline and fall off the Russian for us.
Well, I hope it'll do you both good.
Well now, wait. What do you have to read on? Well, thank you, sir. I generally do it on gin and water. Hoistens the organ, does it, Wig? No, I wouldn't put it quite like that, sir. No, I should say it mellows it. It mellows it is the expression I should use, Mr. Boffin, yes.
So, the mellowing concoction being provided, Mr. and Mrs. Wegg, Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, and Mr. Wegg took their seats for the inaugural reading.
Oh, Wegg, I forgot to mention, when you come in here of an evening and you look around and see anything on a shelf that catches your fancy, well, just mention it. You read my thoughts, sir. Do my eyes deceive me, or is that object up there a pie? It can't be a pie.
Well, yes, it is a pie, Wegg.
Is it indeed, sir? And have I lost my sense for smell, or is that a apple pie?
No, it's a veal and ham pie, Wegg.
"Oh, is it indeed, sir? And there's no better pie than your wheel and hammer." "Well, have some, Wig." "Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Boffin, I will. I wouldn't at any other party, but since you invite me, sir, I will. And meaty jelly too, especially when a little salt, which is the case where there's ham, is mellowing to the organ, very mellowing to the organ."
So the pie was taken down, and Mr. and Mrs. Boffin had to exercise their patience, while Wegg, in the exercise of his knife and fork, did full justice to the pie. Eventually, the pie was finished, and Mr. Boffin lighted his pipe and gazed with beaming eyes upon the prospect before him.
"Well, Mr. Boffin and lady, this is the first chapter of the first volume of the decline and fall of the..."
What's the matter, Wegg?
Why, sir, I think you made a little mistake this morning, which I meant to correct you on, only something took it out of my mind. I think you said Russian Empire, sir.
It is Russian, ain't it?
No, sir. Roman. Roman.
Oh. Well, what's the difference, Wegg?
The difference, sir, the difference, sir, is suffice it to say that the difference is such that we had better not discuss it while Mrs. Boffin honours us with her company. In Mrs. Boffin's presence, we had better drop it.
Mr. Wegg thus came out of his difficulty with something of a chivalrous air, and by dint of repeating with a manly delicacy,
"In Mrs. Boffin's presence, sir, we had better drop it,"
turned the disadvantage on Boffin, who felt that he had committed himself painfully. Then Mr. Wegg, in a dry, unflinching way, entered on his task, going straight across country at everything that came before him, taking all the hard words, biographical and geographical, getting rather shaken by Hadrian, Trajan, and the Antonines, stumbling at Polybius, pronounced Polybius, and supposed by Mr. Boffin to be a Roman virgin, and by Mrs. Boffin to be responsible for that necessity of dropping it. Finally, getting over the ground well with Commodus, who, under the appellation of Commodius, was held by Mr. Boffin to have been quite unworthy of his English origin and not to have acted up to his name in the government of the Roman people. With the death of this personage, Mr. Wegg terminated his first reading. The last part of that scene raises one important issue to do with English respectability, and that's Victorian prudery. A cliché trait of the period that's been much contested over the last half century. Young Dickens started his career as a novelist, having inherited this new code of literary manners. Here's part of the preface to his first book, Pickwick Papers, written when he was about 24, 25 years old. Towards the end of the preface, he says, "The author trusts that throughout this book, no incident or expression occurs which could call a blush into the most delicate cheek or wound the feelings of the most sensitive person." Remember that expression, bring a blush to the cheek. We'll meet it later. We have our anxieties, of course, over mental health risks, and consequently have trigger warnings over sexual content in books. But here's an example of a wholesale revision of literary texts for the delicately nurtured. It comes from Dickens's last book, The Unfinished Mystery of Edwin Drood. The setting is the cathedral city of Cloisterham, where there's a very respectable seminary for young ladies, a training ground for female gentility. presided over by Miss Twinkleton. Miss Twinkleton has a habit of silently revising the reading material for her young pupils, as one of them, Rosa Budd, finds out. Rosa soon made the discovery that Miss Twinkleton didn't read fairly. She cut the love scenes, interpolated passages in praise of female celibacy, and was guilty of other glaring pious frauds. As an instance in point, take this glowing passage, and this is meant to be hot stuff. "Ever dearest and best adored," said Edward, clasping the dear head to his breast and drawing the silken hair through his caressing fingers, from which he suffered it to fall like golden rain. "Ever dearest and best adored, let us fly from the unsympathetic world and the sterile coldness of the stony-hearted to the rich, warm paradise of trust and love." Miss Twinkleton's fraudulent version tamely ran thus: "Ever engaged to me with the consent of our parents on both sides and the approbation of the silver-haired rector of the district," said Edward, respectfully raising to his lips the taper fingers, so skillful in embroidery, tambour, crochet, and other truly feminine arts. "Let me call on thy papa ere tomorrow's dawn has sunk into the west, and propose a suburban establishment, lowly it may be, but within our means, where he will be always welcome as an evening guest, and where every arrangement shall invest economy and constant interchange of scholastic acquirements with the attributes of the ministering angel to domestic bliss." Well, young Dickens boasted of avoiding anything in his stories that might bring a blush to the cheek. The young Dickens, the starting novelist. But in later years, he became very frustrated with what he felt to be the excessive restrictions on English novelists. Here he is writing, soon after a visit to France, confidentially to a friend about these limitations on the novelists in England. "I always have a fine feeling of the honest state into which we have got, when some smooth gentleman says to me, or to someone else when I am by, how odd it is that the hero of an English book is always uninteresting, too good, etc. I'm continually hearing this from English people here who pass their lives with Balzac and George Sand. But oh, my smooth friend, this same unnatural young gentleman whom you meet in those other books and in mine must be presented to you in that unnatural aspect by reason of your morality, and is therefore not to have many of those experiences, trials, perplexities, and confusions inseparable from the making or unmaking of all men." Well, by reason of your morality. Who or what was policing this moral code of respectability throughout Victorian England? Here's an answer from a writer called Horace Mayhew, writing in a magazine, Ladies' Companion at Home and Abroad, in 1849, right in the middle of this period, Dickens. I quote, "If there is a critic in this world who exercises more influence than all the other critics put together, it is Mrs. Grundy. Wherever the English language is spoken, you hear the name of Mrs. Grundy. The sun never sets on the Grundian Empire." Mrs. Grundy was the greatest social influencer of the age. But there's a wonderful mystery about who she was. I don't know I don't know how many are familiar with that Mrs. Grundy name. I faintly heard it when I was very young, invoked half jokingly. But there is this interesting mystery about Mrs. Grundy's origins. She was originally featured as a character in an 18th century light comedy called Speed the Plough. She's a neighbour to the other characters, but she never appears in any scene. She never appears in the play at all. Instead, her intimidating presence is invoked by so many other people in the cast and on stage. And she's always invoked as the intimidating local authority on all matters to do with respectability and gentility. What would Mrs. Grundy say?
What would Mrs. Grundy say?
So Mrs. Grundy, this tyrant, starts as an invisible comic presence and then becomes lodged in the Victorian middle-class mind as an internalized dictator. She's your next-door neighbor from hell, Mrs. Grundy. Walter Bagehot, another prominent social and political critic of the time, said, "You may talk of the tyranny of Nero and Tiberius, but the real tyranny is the tyranny of your next-door neighbor." Dickens mentions this engaging tyrant in an essay on what he calls English insularities. Insularities is the title of the essay. It's really good. And it's a satirical grievance list of his countrymen's hardening conventionalities. So, here's Dickens. "When shall we English get rid of the insularity of being afraid to make the most of small resources and the best of scanty means of enjoyment? In Paris, as in innumerable other places and countries, a man who has 6 square feet of yard or 6 square feet of housetop adorns it in his own poor way and sits there in the fine weather because he likes to do it, because he chooses to do it, because he's got nothing better of his own and has never been laughed out of the enjoyment of what he has got. Equally, he will sit at his door or in his balcony or out on the pavement because it is cheerful and pleasant and he likes to see the life of the city. For the last 70 years, the Frenchman's family have not been tormenting their lives with continual inquiries and speculations whether other families, above and below, to the right and the left, over the way and round the corner, will consider these recreations genteel. That abominable old tyrant, Madame Grundy, has never been of his acquaintance. The result is that with a very small income and in a very dear city, he has more innocent pleasure than 50 Englishmen of the same condition, and is distinctly, in spite of our persuasion to the contrary, which is another insularity, he is a more domestic man than the Englishman, in regard of his simple pleasures being shared with his wife and children. It's a natural consequence of such pleasures being easy and cheap and profoundly independent of Madame Grundy." So with Mrs. Grundy always around, inside you or projected onto your neighbours, you had to make sure that you form a demeanour, that phrase that I mentioned earlier, form a demeanour of visible respectability in whatever you do. And here's a tip from one governessy authority. This is Mrs. General in Little Dorrit, a fearsome woman. She's hired by the newly rich Dorrit family to coach, I'm sorry, that's a spoiler, in case you haven't read Little Dorrit, never mind, to coach the young daughters in ladylike respectability. Well, Little Dorrit, the youngest, in this particular very short scene, has always addressed her father as father, simply. But this is something that provokes Mrs. General to pounce quickly. Papa is a preferable mode of address. Father is rather vulgar, my dear. The word papa, besides, gives a pretty form to the lips. Papa, potatoes, poultry, prunes, and prism. All very good words for the lips, especially prunes and prism. You will find it serviceable in the formation of a demeanour if you sometimes say to yourself in company, on entering a room, for instance, Papa, potatoes, poultry, prunes and prism, prunes and prism. I can see 1 or 2 people practicing this. On the matter of lip management, this important matter of lip management, perhaps the masculine counterpart to the ladylike model would be the stiff upper lip. English respectability comes to be associated with a stiff reserve, especially in men. For both sexes, it seems, as you rose in the ranks, the more reserved and stiffer you needed to become. Tailors and dressmakers accordingly designed clothes fashions to inhibit free movement. Huge quantities of starch and buttons must have been used. This stiffness of dress and demeanour distinguished you from the disorderly, relaxed character and careless clothing of the lower classes. This was part of its design. The lower classes, the mob. Now, the word mob has a very interesting derivation. It was the slang abbreviation for mobility, something like mobilis vulgus in the Latin, signifying the unruly, fickle crowd, the mob, mobility. Though the mobility could move freely, the nobility and the respectable upper middle class moved minimally, buttoned up tightly so they couldn't move. Here's Dickens reflecting on this matter in Little Dorrit again. All buttoned-up men are weighty. All buttoned-up men are believed in. Whether or no wisdom is supposed to condense and augment when buttoned up, and to evaporate when unbuttoned, it is certain that the man to whom importance is accorded is the buttoned-up man. So this stiff respectability distinguished you not only from the disorderly mob, but also from foreigners, especially, of course, the French, who were far too flamboyant and passionate and over-relaxed. And they kept having revolutions, according to the more chauvinistic French. So you needed to counter this by reserve and respectability, stiff control of the emotions. Well, notions of Englishness came into sharp focus for Dickens when he visited the Great Paris International Exhibition in 1855, a kind of follow-up to our great exhibition. And here he is writing in Insularities, that essay again. One of our most remarkable insularities is a tendency to be firmly persuaded that what is not English is not natural. In the fine arts department of the French exhibition, we repeatedly heard, even from the more educated and reflective of our countrymen, that certain pictures which appeared to possess great merit were all very well, but were theatrical. Taking further pains to find out what was meant by the term theatrical, we found that the actions and gestures of the figures were not English. That is to say, the figures expressing themselves in the vivacious manner natural in a greater or less degree to the whole great continent of Europe were overcharged and out of truth, because they did not express themselves in the manner of our little island. They seem to have got a fixed idea that there is no natural manner but the English manner, and that unless a Frenchman, represented as going to the guillotine, for example, is as calm as Clapham, or as respectable as Richmond Hill, he cannot be right. Dickens, actually at this point in the 1850s, middle 1850s, more or less when he's writing Little Dorrit, has really come to the end of his tether of patience with some of these forms of English respectability. And feels it's a serious malaise in the country. Something's really going wrong with the country. It's partly a matter, for humour, but it's also rather more grave, a condition of England. In a private letter, he praises the French paintings in the exhibition. The exhibition brings together painters from all over Europe. There's an English section, French, and so on. He praises the French for a kind of fearlessness that they have. They do produce bad pictures, so badly drawn or whatever, but what Dickens likes about them is what he says, the bold drawing, the dashing conception, the passion and action. I mean, it's this sense of action, passionate action. In a way, it goes back to this idea of the mob and mobility. There's movement, there's action, there's passion. English artists, and he had remorsefully to acknowledge that when he's writing to this friend, that some of the English artists exhibited were friends of his, part of his circle. But he says, nonetheless, it is of no use disguising the fact that what we know to be wanting in the men is wanting in their works. Character, fire, purpose, and the power of using the vehicle and the model as mere means to an end. There is a horrible respectability about most of the best of them, a little finite systematic routine in them, strangely expressive to me of the state of England itself. Mere form and conventionalities usurp in English art, as in English government and social relations, the place of living force and truth. And Little Dorrit, the novel, really comes out of this, this critique. We'll meet now a man who in some ways epitomizes many of these things that Dickens has been talking about. This is Mr. Podsnap from Our Mutual Friend. And this little bit that I'm going to read really homes in on that idea of horrible respectability in the little finite systematic routine, because listen to what Mr. Podsnap's going to say about the arts. Anyway, Podsnappery is the name of the chapter. Mr. Podsnap was well-to-do and stood very high in Mr. Podsnap's opinion. Beginning with a good inheritance, he had married a good inheritance and had thriven exceedingly in the marine insurance way and was quite satisfied. He never could make out why everybody was not quite satisfied. And he felt conscious that he set a brilliant social example in being particularly well satisfied with most things, and above all other things, with himself. Thus, happily acquainted with his own merit and importance, Mr. Podsnap settled that whatever he put behind him, he put out of existence. There was a dignified conclusiveness, not to add a grand convenience in this way of getting rid of disagreeables, which had done much towards establishing Mr. Podsnap in his lofty place in Mr. Podsnap's satisfaction. I don't want to know about it. I don't choose to discuss it. I don't admit it. Mr. Podsnap had even acquired a peculiar flourish of his right arm in often clearing the world of its most difficult problems by sweeping them behind him and consequently sheer away with those words on a flushed face, for they affronted him. Mr. Podsnap's world was not a very large world, morally. No, nor even geographically, seeing that although his business was sustained upon commerce with other countries, he considered other countries, with that important reservation, a mistake, and of their manners and customs would conclusively observe, not English. Elsewise, the world got up at 8, shaved close at 5:15, breakfasted at 9, went to the city at 10, came home at 5:30 and dined at 7. Mr. Podsnap's notions of the arts in their integrity might have been stated thus. Literature, large print, respectively descriptive of getting up at 8, shaving close at 5:15, breakfasting at 9, going to the city at 10, coming home at 5:30 and dining at 7. Painting and sculpture. Models and portraits representing professors of getting up at 8, shaving close at 5:15, breakfasting at 9, going to the city at 10, coming home at 5:30 and dining at 7. Music. A respectable performance without variations on stringed and wind instruments, sedately expressive of getting up at 8, shaving close at 5:15, breakfasting at 9, going to the city at 10, coming home at 5:30 and dining at 7. Nothing else to be permitted to those same vagrants, the arts, on pain of excommunication. Nothing else to be anywhere. We'll come back to Mr. Podsnap. One of the staples of Dickens's comedy, to return really to the comedy from his strictures on English culture, was puncturing pomposity, exposing pretentious and buttoned-up respectability. And I mean, it's a continuing tradition in English comedy, isn't it? It's a staple of English comedy now. Think of Hyacinth Bouquet, if you're familiar with that lady, or Basil Fawlty. And is often the agent of a character from the mob, from the mobility, who upsets or runs rings around stiff respectability. But it needn't even be a character. It could be some other form of disruptive mobility, such as the sea. Here's Dickens in an early novel, Barnaby Rudge, reflecting on this phenomenon, the mob. A mob is usually a creature of very mysterious existence, particularly in a large city. Where it comes from or whither it goes, few men can tell. Assembling and dispersing with equal suddenness, it is as difficult to follow to its various sources as the sea itself. Nor does the parallel stop here, for the ocean is not more fickle and uncertain, more terrible when roused, more unreasonable or more cruel. And this is a way of chewing in one of my favourite anecdotes. It comes from a letter written by Dickens soon after he's crossed to America in 1867 for his reading tour of America. And he's writing to a friend to report on the Atlantic crossing. The crossing was made in winter, and he is talking about something that happened on a Sunday when a church service was meant to be taking place, and the sea was absolutely tumultuous. One of the most comical spectacles I've ever seen in my life was church with a heavy sea on, in the saloon of the Cunard steamer coming out. The officiating minister, an extremely modest young man, was brought in between two stewards, exactly as if he were coming up to the scratch in a prize fight. The ship was rolling and pitching so that the two big stewards had to stop and watch their opportunity of making a dart at the reading desk with their reverent charge. During which pause, he held on, now by one steward and now by the other, with the feeblest expression of countenance and no legs whatever. At length, they made a dart at the wrong moment, and one steward was immediately beheld alone in the extreme perspective, while the other and the reverend gentleman held on to the mast in the middle of the saloon, which the latter embraced with both arms as if it were his wife. All this time, the congregation were breaking up into sects and sliding away. And when at last the reverend gentleman had been tumbled into his place, the desk, a loose one upon the dining table, deviated from the church bodily and went over to the purser. The scene was so extraordinarily ridiculous, and was made so much more so by the exemplary gravity of all concerned in it, that I was obliged to leave before the service began. So while mobility of any kind can threaten to collapse respectability, and it's pure joy for Dickens when this sort of thing happens. But just think of that word, to collapse respectability. Thinking of our expressions now when we lose control over ourselves or our situations. He broke down in tears. They fell apart laughing. She went to pieces after he left. And then think of the contrary command. Stay cool, calm, and collected. Pull yourself together. I mean, there's several analogies there. On pulling oneself together, just to return briefly to our old friend, Mr. Wegg. Mr. Wegg, I don't think I mentioned earlier, has a wooden leg. He had an amputation in hospital, and his leg, the lower part of his leg, was bought by a taxidermist, Mr. Venus, who took it off to his shop, where he articulated skeletons and stuffed birds and did all sorts of things. And Mr. Wegg is well aware of where his leg went. And once he's hired by Boffin, he thinks he's rising up in the world, so he's quite anxious to retrieve his leg. So he goes rather sheepishly to Mr. Venus's shop and has a cup of tea with Mr. Venus and sort of looks around and wonders where his leg is. And then said, Mr. Venus, do you still have my leg? Mr. Venus said, yes. And Mr. Wegg is rather struck by this and says, oh, well, I wonder, couldn't you sell it? Couldn't you use it? Mr. Venus says, well, no, not really. It's a funny shape, that leg. It's slightly bent. And Wegg gets rather indignant in this. And they said, I don't believe it. So Mr. Venus brings the leg over from the back shop and brings another leg from a kind of model skeleton and puts them side by side and tries it. And Mr. Wake puts his leg like that. And Dickens described it as though he were being measured for a riding boot, looking at these two. And the perfect straight one, he says, I don't know where that came from, I bet it isn't a British one. and Mr. Wiener said, no, it's true, we run a lot to foreign imports. It belongs to that gentleman over there. And Wade turns round and then sees this half skeleton looking like somebody in a corset. It's the upper part there. And Mr. Wiener has said it belongs to that French gentleman over there. Mr. Wade. I mean, that's red rag to a bull. So he confronts this quite inert skeleton and berates him, saying, "Oh, well, I'm glad I don't want any of your bones of mine." But then he starts pleading with Mr. Venus, and says as follows, thinking of our buttoning up and pulling together.
I have a prospect of getting on in life and elevating myself by my own independent exertions, and I should not like, under such circumstances, to be what I may call dispersed. A part of me here and a part of me there, but to wish to collect myself like a genteel person.
And that sort of sums it up. So we finish now by rejoining Mr. Podsnap and his guests. Mr. and Mrs. Podsnap are giving a dinner this evening, for which their table is sumptuously laid. Hideous solidity was the characteristic of the Podsnap plate. Everything was made to look as heavy as it could and to take up as much room as possible. Everything said boastfully, "Here you have as much of me and my ugliness as if I were only lead. But I am so many ounces of precious metal, worth so much an ounce. Wouldn't you like to melt me down?" A corpulent, straggling centerpiece, blotched all over as if it had broken out in an eruption rather than been ornamented, delivered this address from an unsightly silver platform in the center of the table. All the big silver spoons and forks widened the mouths of the company, expressly for the purpose of thrusting the sentiment down their throats with every morsel they ate. The majority of the guests were like the plate and included several heavy articles weighing ever so much. But there was a foreign gentleman among them, whom Mr. Podsnap had invited after much debate with himself, and there was a droll disposition, not only on the part of Mr. Podsnap, but of everybody else, to treat him as if he were a child who was hard of hearing. As a delicate concession to this unfortunately born foreigner, Mr. Podsnap, in receiving him, had presented his wife as Madame Podsnap, and his daughter as Mademoiselle Podsnap, with some inclination to add ma fille, in which bold venture, however, he checked himself and conducted his guests to the table, ensuring that the foreign gentleman sat opposite him.
How do you like London? London, Londra, London.
The foreign gentleman admired it.
You find it very large.
The foreign gentleman found it very large.
And very rich.
The foreign gentleman found it without doubt.
Enormément riche. Enormously rich, we say. Our English adverbs do not terminate in mong. And we pronounce the CH as if there were a T before it. We say rich. Rich. And do you find many evidences that strike you of our British Constitution in the streets of the world's metropolis, London, Londra, London?
The foreign gentleman begged to be pardoned, but did not altogether understand.
The Constitution, sir, the Constitution Britannique. We say British, but you say Britannique, you know. Yeah, no. The Constitution, sir. Yes, I know him. A youngish, sallowish gentleman in spectacles with a lumpy forehead, seated in a supplementary chair at a corner of the table, here caused a profound sensation by saying in a raised voice, "Esca," and then stopping dead. "Esca, oui, quoi donc?" But the gentleman with the lumpy forehead, having for the time delivered himself of all that he found behind his lumps, spake for the time no more. "I was merely inquiring whether you have observed in our streets, as we should say, upon our pavé, as you would say, any tokens." The foreign gentleman with patient courtesy entreated pardon, but what was tokens? "Oh, signs, you know, appearances, traces." "Ah, traces of a horse." What? In England, Angleterre, England, we aspirate the H and we say horse. Horse. Only our lower classes say horse. Oh, pardon, I am always wrong. Ours is a difficult language. Ours is a copious language and trying to strangers. I will not pursue my question. But the lumpy gentleman, unwilling to give it up, again madly said, "Esca," and again spake no more. Merely referred to our Constitution, sir. We English are very proud of our Constitution, sir. It was bestowed upon us by Providence. No other country is so favoured as this country. And other country? We do not say other, we say other. The letters are T and H. Well, you say a T and H, you know. The sound is th, th. And other countries, they do how? Oh, they do, sir. Well, they do. I'm sorry to be obliged to say it, as they do. So it is. It was the charter of the land. This island was blessed, sir, to the direct exclusion of such other countries as there may happen to be. And, well, if we were all English present, I would say that there is in the Englishman a combination of qualities: a modesty, a repose, a respectability, an independence, combined with an absence of everything calculated to call a cheek into the young person's blush, which one would seek in vain among the nations of the earth. With this little summary, Mr. Podsnap's face flushed as he thought of the remote possibility of its being at all qualified by any prejudiced citizen of any other country. And with his favourite right arm flourish, he put the rest of Europe, the whole of Asia, Africa, and America nowhere. And that finishes my part of the evening. Thank you very much.